July 4th, 1187. In the scorching desert heat near the Sea of Galilee, the most powerful Crusader army ever assembled was about to be completely annihilated. By sunset, the Christian Kingdom of Jerusalem would lie in ruins, and the Crusades would never be the same again. This is the story of how one catastrophic battle changed the course of history forever. The year 1187 began with the Crusader states seemingly secure in their dominance over the Holy Land. For nearly a century, Christian knights had carved out kingdoms stretching from Antioch in the north to the deserts of Jordan in the south. Jerusalem, the crown jewel of Christendom, stood as a symbol of European power in the heart of the Muslim world. But beneath this facade of strength, cracks were already forming that would soon shatter everything the Crusaders had built. At the center of this brewing storm was a Kurdish warrior named Yusuf ibn Ayyub, better known to history as Saladin. Unlike the fractured Muslim rulers who had come before him, Saladin possessed something far more dangerous than military skill. He had vision. Since becoming vizier of Egypt in 1169, he had systematically united the Muslim world under his banner through a combination of political cunning, religious fervor, and calculated warfare. The transformation was remarkable. In 1174, Saladin seized Damascus. By 1183, Aleppo had fallen to his forces. City by city, alliance by alliance, he was forging something the Crusaders had never faced before. A unified Muslim coalition stretching from Egypt to Mesopotamia. For the first time in decades, the Christians found themselves surrounded not by squabbling emirates, but by a single, determined enemy with the resources of multiple kingdoms at his disposal. What made Saladin truly formidable was his ability to frame this conflict in religious terms. He convinced his subjects that this was not merely another territorial dispute, but a holy war to reclaim Jerusalem from foreign invaders. Under the banner of Sunni Islam, warriors from across the Middle East flocked to his cause. The Crusaders, who had long benefited from Muslim divisions, now faced an enemy united by faith and purpose. But while Saladin was building his coalition, the Crusader leadership was tearing itself apart from within. The Kingdom of Jerusalem had become a powder keg of competing ambitions and personal vendettas. At the heart of these divisions stood three men whose hatred for each other would prove more destructive than any enemy army. King Guy of Lusignan had recently claimed the throne through marriage to Queen Sibylla, but his legitimacy was constantly questioned. Many nobles viewed him as weak and indecisive, a puppet of his wife's ambitions rather than a true leader. His authority was challenged at every turn by powerful barons who believed they had better claims to power. Chief among these rivals was Raymond III of Tripoli, one of the most experienced military commanders in the Crusader states. Raymond possessed the political cunning and battlefield experience that Guy lacked, but he also harbored deep resentment toward the new king. Their relationship had deteriorated to the point where Raymond was openly negotiating with Saladin, preferring the Muslim leader to his own supposed sovereign. Then there was Raynald of Chatillon, perhaps the most reckless and dangerous of the three. Master of the fortress of Kerak, Raynald was a throwback to an earlier, more brutal era of the Crusades. Where others sought diplomatic solutions, he preferred the sword. Where others honoured truces, he saw only opportunities for personal gain. His actions would soon provide Saladin with exactly the pretext he needed to launch his final campaign. The spark that ignited this conflict came in early 1187, when Raynald committed an act that would doom the entire kingdom. Despite a truce between Saladin and the Crusader states, Raynald attacked a Muslim merchant caravan travelling the pilgrimage route to Mecca. This was not merely banditry, it was a deliberate provocation that violated the most sacred obligations of medieval warfare. The caravan was carrying pilgrims on their way to perform the Hajj, one of the 5 pillars of Islam. By attacking it, Raynald had not only broken the truce but had struck at the very heart of Muslim religious practice. When word reached Saladin, he reportedly declared that he would personally execute Raynald for this betrayal. The die was cast. Saladin's response was swift and calculated. Rather than launching an immediate assault on Raynald's fortress, he devised a strategy that would draw the entire Crusader army into a trap. On July 2nd, 1187, his forces struck at the city of Tiberias, a strategically important but lightly defended settlement near the Sea of Galilee. The attack on Tiberias was brilliant in its simplicity. The city was ruled by Raymond of Tripoli, but his wife Esquiva was trapped inside with only a small garrison. When news of the assault reached the Crusader leadership, they faced an impossible choice. They could remain safely in their fortified positions at Sephoria, or they could march to relieve Tiberias and risk everything in open battle. King Guy found himself caught between conflicting advice. Raymond of Tripoli, despite being personally affected by the attack, counselled patience. He argued that Tiberias could be rebuilt, but if they lost the field army, the entire kingdom would fall. It was sound military logic, but it ignored the political realities Guy faced. The king had already been criticised as weak and indecisive. If he allowed Raymond's wife to fall into enemy hands without attempting a rescue, his already fragile authority would collapse entirely. The warrior nobles of the kingdom expected their king to fight, not to calculate odds like a merchant counting coins. Gerard de Riedfort, Grand Master of the Knights Templar, pressed for immediate action. The military orders had their own reasons for wanting battle. They had been established to fight the enemies of Christ, and a defensive strategy offered little opportunity for glory or plunder. Their voices carried enormous weight in a kingdom where religious and military authority were inseparable. Under this pressure, Guy made the fateful decision to march. On July 3rd, 1187, the largest Crusader army ever assembled began its advance toward Tiberias. It was a force that represented the complete military might of the Christian kingdom. Nearly every able-bodied knight from Jerusalem to Antioch had been called to arms. Additional mercenaries had been hired using the annual tribute sent by King Henry II of England for the defence of the Holy Land. The numbers were impressive. Over 16,000 men, including around 1,300 mounted knights and 15,000 infantry. It was a massive army by medieval standards, larger than many that had conquered entire kingdoms. But it was also the kingdom's final gamble. In assembling this force, the Crusaders had stripped their castles and cities of their garrisons. If this army was destroyed, there would be nothing left to defend the realm. As the great host began its march across the rocky terrain of Galilee, few could have imagined they were walking into the most carefully prepared trap in medieval military history. Saladin had spent months positioning his forces, controlling water sources, and studying the routes the Crusaders would be forced to take. Every step of their advance had been anticipated and planned for. The march quickly turned into a nightmare of heat, thirst, and constant harassment. The July sun beat down mercilessly on knights encased in heavy mail and plate armour. The rocky terrain made formation difficult to maintain, while Muslim light cavalry struck at the flanks and rear, loosing clouds of arrows before disappearing into the hills. By nightfall on July 3rd, the situation had become desperate. The Crusader army found itself trapped on a barren plateau between two rocky hills known as the Horns of Hattin. Below them lay the Sea of Galilee, its waters tantalizingly close yet completely unreachable. Saladin's forces had positioned themselves between the Christians and every possible water source, creating a siege without walls. The Muslim commander had orchestrated this moment with surgical precision. His troops were well supplied, regularly rotated, and fighting on familiar ground. Meanwhile, the flower of Christian knighthood sat parched and exhausted, their horses dying beneath them, their armour becoming furnaces in the desert heat. It was psychological warfare at its most brutal, and it was working perfectly. As dawn broke on July 4th, 1187, Saladin ordered his men to set fire to the dry grass surrounding the Christian camp. Thick, choking smoke billowed across the plateau, blinding the already demoralized Crusaders and adding suffocating heat to their misery. The symbolism was unmistakable. This was not merely a battle, it was a purification by fire. What followed was less a military engagement than a systematic destruction. Saladin's mounted archers, supplied with 400 loads of fresh arrows brought up during the night, unleashed volley after volley into the packed Christian ranks. The Crusaders, trained for close combat, found themselves helpless against this rain of death from a distance. Count Raymond of Tripoli, recognizing the hopelessness of their situation, attempted two desperate cavalry charges to break through to the waters of Lake Tiberias. Both failed catastrophically. In a final act of self-preservation, Raymond and his remaining knights abandoned the field entirely, leaving King Guy's forces completely isolated. The collapse was swift and total. The Christian infantry, driven mad by thirst and terror, broke ranks and fled en masse to the rocky outcrops of the Horns themselves. There they huddled like sheep, taking no further part in the battle, while their noble commanders faced annihilation below. King Guy, mounted on his destrier and surrounded by his household knights, made 3 final desperate charges at Saladin's position. Each assault was beaten back with devastating losses. The cream of Christian nobility fell in those moments, their heavy cavalry tactics useless against the mobile warfare of their enemies. When the last charge faltered, the battle was over. Of the 16,000 men who had marched from Sephoria, barely 200 knights escaped with their lives. The rest lay dead on the field or knelt in chains before their captors. Among the prizes taken was a fragment of the true cross, carried into battle by the Bishop of Acre and now lost forever to Christendom. Saladin's treatment of the prisoners revealed both his political wisdom and his personal vendettas. King Guy and most of the Christian lords were spared, too valuable as hostages and too useful for future negotiations. But when Raynald of Châtillon was brought before him, Saladin personally drew his sword and struck off the head of the man who had broken the sacred truce. It was justice, medieval style, swift and final. The military orders fared far worse. Nearly every captured Templar and Hospitaller was executed on Saladin's orders. These warrior monks, sworn to perpetual war against Islam, represented everything he sought to eliminate from the Holy Land. Only Gérard de Riedfort, Grand Master of the Templars, was spared, perhaps kept alive as a symbol of Christian defeat. The true catastrophe of Hattin became clear in the days that followed. With the field army destroyed and the kingdom's castles stripped of their garrisons, there was nothing left to resist Saladin's advance. City after city fell like dominoes. Acre, Nablus, Jaffa, Sidon, Beirut, Ascalon. Each surrender brought Saladin closer to his ultimate prize. On October 2nd, 1187, barely 3 months after Hattin, the gates of Jerusalem opened to Muslim forces. The city that had been the heart of the Crusader enterprise for 88 years was lost in a single campaign. Saladin's magnanimous treatment of the Christian population, allowing those who could pay ransom to leave safely, only highlighted the completeness of his victory. The psychological impact on Christian Europe was devastating. When news of the disaster reached Rome, Pope Urban III reportedly died of shock upon hearing the report. The Third Crusade that followed, despite being led by 3 of Europe's most powerful monarchs, could only partially restore Christian fortunes in the East. Richard the Lionheart's brilliant tactical victories at Arsuf and elsewhere proved that individual battles could still be won. The Treaty of Jaffa in 1192 secured a coastal strip from Tyre to Jaffa for the Christians, but Jerusalem itself remained in Muslim hands, and the truncated kingdom that emerged from the Third Crusade was a pale shadow of its former glory. The fundamental balance of power had shifted permanently at Hattin. Never again would the Crusaders possess the overwhelming military superiority they had enjoyed in the early decades of their presence. The Muslim world had learned the lessons of unity under Saladin's leadership, and future conflicts would be fought on far more equal terms. The final collapse came in 1244 at the Battle of Lafourbi, where the last great Crusader army in the east was destroyed by Mamluk forces. But that defeat was merely the final chapter in a story that had begun at Hattin 57 years earlier. The Battle of Hattin stands as one of history's most decisive engagements, a single day that changed the trajectory of civilizations. It demonstrated how quickly centuries of conquest could be undone by strategic brilliance, political division, and the brutal realities of medieval warfare. The Crusaders never recovered because they never again faced their enemies as a unified force, while their opponents had learned the power of coordination and purpose. In the scorching heat of a July morning in 1187, more than an army died on the Horns of Hattin. An entire world order perished, and with it, the dream of a permanent Christian presence in the heart of the Islamic world.